Today I'm joined by Kirk Zeller, entrepreneur at quite a few companies. Kirk, I'll let you take it away. Thank you for being
All
here.
right. Yeah, I'm Kirk Zeller. I'm founder of the Silicon Prairie Center, where we incubate companies. We have two MedTech companies, one an ischemic stroke company, and another a suture management for robotic surgery company called Suture Shield. And then we have a market access firm, which helps companies get into markets principally in Asia, and really mostly the focus is on Japan. Started it with one of the folks that I went to university with in Japan. And then we also have other companies that are located at the Silicon Prairie Center, Gentic AI and others that aren't MedTech related, but I'm not running those companies. I just, provide the little micro ecosystem, if you will, for them.
So, tell me, Kirk, you've got quite a lot of experience here. How did you get into this industry in the first place?
Yeah, I have a very atypical, starting point, if you will. So I did most of my undergraduate studies in Japan. I knew, even during university that I wanted to get into biotech or med tech, somewhere in healthcare. I was really driven by wanting to feel like I'm making a difference. If I'm putting in 12-hour days, I want to feel like it's really going to the greater good in some form or another. So, healthcare was kind of a natural, just kind of a natural for that mindset. And as soon as I finished university, well, actually, as soon as I finished classes, but before I graduated university, I started looking for a job in Japan in medical devices, going to, doing the, typical, Japanese type, shusho katsudo, looking for a job. And the first job fair I went to, I was in Nagoya on that day. There was a local Nagoya medical device company called Goodman, which has, since been acquired by Nipro and is now a part of Nipro. But I got a job there as effectively a heart valve sales rep. So straight out of university, jump into this role. Even before graduation, I didn't bother going to graduation. I quickly got a job when I finished my last class and just jumped right in. And it was really, you would think, being a native English speaker, that I could just pick up clinical papers and textbooks and read it and immediately understand. What I quickly realized was that, medical language and English is largely Latin based, which if you studied Latin, it's probably a breeze. If you have never studied Latin, which this farm boy from Nebraska didn't, you have no idea what it means. And so then then I looked and found some of the papers in the office in Japanese, and characters are characters. There's no medical Japanese. The characters for heart are heart. There's no medical version of heart. There's no, cardiac versus heart. There is only one word. And so I realized immediately, after struggling for a week or so trying to read the papers in English and study in English, I realized it was much easier for me to do it in Japanese. As long as you know the characters, you don't need to have ever seen the word in your life. You immediately know what it means. You can deduct the meaning from the characters. And so that's how I got going. And I was out, in procedures and cardiac surgery procedures, heart valve replacement procedures, within a few months, of starting in the industry. And I did the early part of my career in Japan, went from one Japanese distributor to another, from Goodman to Japan Lifeline. And that company was growing rapidly, went public. I was involved with helping, a lot of the things that we needed to do to go public, including working closely with our biggest partner for the products we were distributing at the time. Sulzer Medica was a Swiss company. And so I kind of became the intermediary for some of those divisions. And then when the companies went public, I ended up getting relocated to Austin, Texas, after spending several years working in sales and marketing roles in Japan. And so worked on bringing a lot of, products from Silicon Valley and around the US and some certainly from Europe, from the UK, from Germany, from Sweden, into the Japanese market. And then, in the process of doing that, had the opportunity to get relocated to Europe. And while there, I did biopharma and health technology focused MBA at Imperial College London, and then followed that up with a DBA at the International School of Management in Paris. And I did the research for both those degrees on medical device startup related topics. So, then I jumped right into doing startups, and I've been doing startups ever since. And a good chunk of the time doing startups while at the same time helping companies get into the Japanese market. And I have a business partner in Japan and other folks that are involved in that business. And so, so I've kind of been doing startups and the market access firm in parallel.
Quite the experience you have here, eh?
So it's very atypical.
Yeah, I'm still trying to wrap my head around it here. So, knowing where you've come from, How did that really translate to you starting all of these companies you've started now? I know you said you've worked in startups, but what gave you that initiative to start these different medtech companies you're working on at the moment?
Yeah, I mean, I was always drawn to that. I think the first thing that really got me locked into that as a pathway for my career, was the company CTS, Cardiothoracic Systems. They were the company that pioneered off-pump bypass. So basically doing coronary artery bypass grafting without putting the patient on the heart-lung machine. And that company went from an idea to being a publicly traded company in something like 9 months. There's never been anything before it or since then on that scale. It just blew up. And I think it wasn't the success of the company that I was drawn to. It was being there. And they did, some of the early work, surprisingly, in Japan. We had a doctor in Japan that was really at the forefront of doing off-pump bypass surgery. And that really was a big inspiration for me, seeing these older patients that probably wouldn't be candidates for surgery if they had to be put on the heart-lung machine, really being able to treat those patients and extend their lives and keep grandma and grandpa along for, around for the grandkids and things. And I got a lot of inspiration out of that. Then I started thinking, okay, this is definitely what I want to do. And then, I got to the point where I want to do an MBA that's hyper focused on, achieving my goals. That really not a general MBA where I'm with a bunch of people, somebody who run the chain of ice cream parlors and somebody who runs a chain of tire shops and, and somebody maybe in, that runs the CPA firm or something. I wanted to be with people, that I was going to learn from at the end of the day. And so I, scoured the planet. I had a stack this high in my office and, my apartment in Japan of MBA guides, everyone I could find, I consumed. And at that point, the one that seemed like made the most sense for me was the program at Imperial College London in the UK. And that school's subsequently done well. It just came out, a global university ranking just came out recently, ranking it the number 2 school in the world after MIT. So it turned out to be a great choice. You never know. It's not one that's known in America and known to all, to Europeans, but I was recently at an Imperial event in the Bay Area. And it's funny because I often heard Imperial described as the MIT of Europe, and the one of the chancellors gets up and he's like, I want to talk about the Imperial of America, referring to MIT. It was anyways a great experience. Really put me on the right path for doing this. I had the opportunity to spin out 2 of their medical device companies while I was there, write the business plans and raise the seed funding, and so it really set the stage. So when I finished those 2 back-to-back degrees to just jump right into doing startups. But I never left, that the core of, my initial experience with Japan behind. It was always been a part of it. One of the startups we're looking at doing first in human in Japan, which is very, very atypical, but other companies have done it in that space. And, part of the reason for doing it, if you have a world-renowned doctor in a first world country, you do first in human there, get good results, and then you start talking to clinical trial sites in the US, and they believe that data. If it's from data from a doctor in a country they've never even, doctor they've never heard of in a country that he couldn't even find on a map, they're, the way they see that data, they question it. They're a little bit skeptical. So, yeah, so I try to, leverage that network and experience and expertise, related to Japan and pretty much everything I do.
So what does your average day-to-day look like? How are you spending your time, at least working?
There's no typical day, to be honest. I mean, I can give you an example. What yesterday and the day before that, we're working to close financing, getting close to closing the seed round for Suture Shield. And, I had, starting from Sunday all the way through to yesterday, I was, finishing off a data room and getting, filling out all the materials. Next week, it goes in front of 2 venture capital firms. So that's what this week's been like. It's been primarily focused on Suture Shield. There's weeks that's primarily focused on progressive neuro. Last night until the middle of the night, I was working on and reviewing some stuff. One of my colleagues, so some research they did for the market access firm. So it's kind of jumping around to whatever the biggest fire of the day. And in the current funding environment, everything's understaffed. And I think we're all faced with this really challenging fundraising environment. You go to any MedTech conference, and that's pretty much all anybody wants to talk about. But you're kind of talking in circles because everybody talks about it, but nobody has a solution. So you kind of leave, you're feeling very unsatisfied having those conversations. But the reality is every company's grossly understaffed because we have to run on really meager budgets. So, ultimately my day is putting out the biggest fire of the day, dealing with whatever's at that intersection of both urgent and important and, getting it done. And, I look forward to the day when it's easier to raise money and, we can raise larger amounts of money and not have to work 7 days a week to really keep the businesses going. But that's the harsh reality. And if you don't do that, you're probably not going to make it through this fairly bleak period, just to be blunt.
That's a common theme that I've heard in the industry recently. Raising capital is very,
Oh,
very
yeah.
difficult for medtech companies. How are you going about raising capital here?
Well, that's an excellent question. Honestly, it is so different now. So, going back to what I was mentioning about my degrees, I mean, I specifically did those degrees and specifically did topics for my research for my master's and doctorate on topics related to the financing of medical device companies, and able to really develop the expertise, but also develop the network. Because this was a lot of primary research. I was going out and talking to venture capital firms and CEOs of startups. And so I thought, I'm going to be set that day when I start my startup. I'm going to be set because I already know the landscape. I already know, who's who and how it works and how each of the financing works and what the typical size is. All that's irrelevant now. Most of the VC firms that I interviewed, I don't know if any of them actually, there may be one that's still operating as a VC firm, but most of the ones that were prominent in that era are gone now. Most of the people the network that I built, they've moved on. They're doing other things. There are some that are still around, but it's a very small percentage. And the current environment is no longer about going to the prominent medtech, VCs of the time and raising money. It's really, going to family offices and going to super angels and, maybe getting some money from strategics. In Nebraska, we had this great thing, the Business Innovation Act. So we had, Invest Nebraska, a fund that funds startups in Nebraska, which still exists. And, and it's got a great staff and they're doing a great job for startups in Nebraska. And then we had also through the Business Innovation Act, we had grant programs, which a lot of times would help us with our initial studies and things. In this current environment of cut in the government, a lot of that, funding's gone away, as has, we also relied on NIH grants and NSF grants, and all that stuff has really gone away. So we're at this point, you think, okay, we'll just double down on grants. Well, there's no money there either, so it's a really challenging time. And, talking to some people, in the finance world, they feel like what's happened is, a lot of these, families and different high net worth individuals that used to put money into venture funds are like, why am I going to put money in? Why do I put money into venture fund and pay management fees to a lot of these folks? We can just, have our own family office. And it seems that is kind of become the trend. I might be wrong on that, but several people that are deeper in the space than I am have mentioned they feel like that's what's going on. That a lot of these people have stopped becoming LPs in funds and just started doing it directly. So, it's created an environment where we're not going out to educated investors. Before, these VC firms were a lot of times run by entrepreneurs like myself. You have a few exits, you use some of that money, you create a fund with a bunch of your buddies, or, you join one already in existence. And that was kind of my vision and dream at one point as well, but all that's changed. I do hope someday I can have, my own fund based in Nebraska, but, I've got to have a few exits to get to that point.
Yeah, another common theme that I've heard, which is probably impacting the lack of funding in the medtech world right now, is the current financial landscape with, quite simply, AI and crypto booming. Companies just want to invest in quicker returns. Have you noticed the same thing?
Oh, absolutely. And I just got, somebody sent me data from PitchBook, which is where you go to, dig up all the details on financings. And, first of all, the early stage medtech financing is at abysmal lows, possibly all-time lows. And then the second interesting tidbit from the most recent report I saw was that 70% of the companies that did get funded have some AI component to their medical device. So no doubt AI is huge. And I live it, when I'm at the Silicon Prairie Center, one of the other companies there is an agentic AI company. And so I'm, as I'm in the office, I'm hearing the conversations and talking to him and learning about it. And, I can appreciate, the enthusiasm. And recently at the Imperial event in San Francisco, Vinod Khosla, one of the world's most famous investors, I think has a net worth of about 12 billion, early not med tech, but early technology investor. People ask him, where is AI going to have this biggest impact? And he was basically like healthcare. It's the first time in history where you can, healthcare will become much more scalable. If you need more doctors, there's a long lead time to producing more doctors, but you could leverage AI to make the doctors more efficient and subsequently giving them more bandwidth. Same thing for the nurses. I was at the University of Nebraska Medical Center 2 weeks ago, judging Shark Tank competition there that was related to, the use of, a lot of it was related to, bedside and falls in particular, but the use of, how AI could really change a lot of things. So, that topic is everywhere you go. We have ideas about how to integrate AI into our ischemic stroke device, but it's still early days for most of us. I realize some people have been deep in AI for years, but for most of us, we're just kind of starting to kind of develop a little bit of an understanding.
Yeah. Another like little side tangent here, but another only place I've heard that AI is actually becoming profitable, not necessarily having good use cases, is in small firms doing like weird tasks, you know? Anyways,
No,
something
I think
that
there probably is some validity to that because there's so much. I was at a meeting a while back with that involved, a bunch of us at the Silicon Prairie Center, and we were kind of talking about how to use one of the buildings we have there most effectively. And we had, his AI assistant listening the whole time and every now and then we'd ask it a question. Hey, what's, well, here's the kind of name we want for this, building. Like, give us some examples. And at the end of it, like, hey, he's like, hey, can you, summarize everything we talked about in a spreadsheet and email it to me? And boom, he got it. And it's mind boggling at how well all that works, So there's, practical, I think small businesses are going to benefit a lot from AI, people that don't really, businesses that don't have the bandwidth to do a lot of the stuff themselves. So who knows, it may level the playing field a bit for some of the bigger companies in the short term. Bigger companies will also, without doubt, start leveraging it efficiently with time. But
so one of my favorite questions here, and I'm going to exclude capital from this because you've already spoken about this. But if you had a magic wand and this magic wand could fix any problem in any of your companies, what would it be and why? Besides capital, right?
Yeah, no, that's the one. That's the obvious answer that everybody would give you
Of
straight away on
course.
that question. Anybody in MedTech right now? I mean, the other challenge really, you have IP challenges at times. We're blessed with progressive neuro, and I think we have 11 issued IP, patents now, I believe. So we're doing well on that front. I mean, it's really, if I could magically get us through V and V faster for less expense and be all queued up and ready for first in human, that would be a wonderful thing. But when you're in a capital constrained environment and have to go out and build hundreds of nitinol devices implementing nitinol and other fairly expensive materials, it's time consuming and expensive to navigate that process. And that's like the one thing we've got ahead of us to get us to a big value inflection point of first in human.
Well, Kirk, where can our viewers get in touch with you if they would like?
Yeah, I mean, you can look me up, siliconprairiecenter.com. Progressive Neuro's website is progressive-neuro.com. Suture Shield is suture-shield.com. And then Med Market Access is asianmeddevice.com. So you can find me, on any of those websites, and there's, contact buttons there. So I'm pretty easy to find. You Google me, you'll find more than you'd ever want to know about me.
Awesome. And do you have any last pearls of wisdom you'd like to leave for our listeners?
Yeah, I think right now a lot of us, whether you're, at a mid-sized company, and particularly if you're a startup, I mean, it is all about financing right now. That's the big challenge we all face. And I think, just finding lean ways to move forward, looking under every rock, persevering. I mean, that's really it. We got some money from a venture capital firm a couple weeks ago for Suture Shield, and that was, it was just relentless, trying everything, doing every pitch competition, every angel group. And, and it's oftentimes not where you expected. That one, we did a pitch competition. We won the pitch competition. That got the attention of the VC, and, and then we get the funding, so and I think one of the challenges I find in talking, particularly my veteran startup colleagues, is, they have a template for how they do things, and they're still trying to use that template. It doesn't work right now. Like, you got to forget what you thought you knew about raising money and building companies. And, there was a term, and still is a term, lean startup. I mean, now it's like super, uber lean startup, trying to get by with next to nothing. But you've really got to be resourceful. And I think right now, if you can leverage AI in some way, that requires less use of consultants or employees, and you're going to have to do it. You just really got to, you've got to think creatively. You've got to think outside the box. Got to not get caught up in what you thought you knew, and be really open to new ways of doing things, because times are changing and the AI is changing everything so fast. It's hard to keep up with it, but, also keeping an open mind on that. because I do think it is going to be an important productivity tool. A lot of people were very skeptical in the beginning, but I think it's proven in my limited exposure to it to be very, very productive tool. So don't be shy about, learning how to use Chat GPT and some of the other, platforms out there.
Well, Kirk, thank you so much for your time here. I really appreciate it, and I'm sure our listeners would too.
All right. Great to be on. Thanks.